Hi everyone, it is Mike Burt here. Welcome to another episode of Nazareth, Nicaea, the podcast and vodcast, where I try to keep people plugged into everything about the historical Jesus, the Christ of faith, and whatever there is in between. This week, I want to have a big deep dive into Colossians 1:15 to 20, the Colossian Christ poem. I think this is one of the most important texts in all of the Pauline corpus. It's certainly comparable to Philippians in its import, but unlike the series of videos I did on Philippians, Philippians 2:6 to 11, I'm not going to do 4 or 5 episodes on this. I could do, but I'm not. Instead, I'm going to try be a lot more succinct, and I'm going to try, in about 7 points, tease out what I think are the main issues of the Christ poem in Colossians 1:15 to 20. Now, this is a text that could be a piece of pre-Pauline material. It could be hymnic or traditional material. We just don't know. I mean, there's also debates about the authorship of Colossians. But what makes this Christ poem so profound is that it seems to put Christ at the very center of the work of both creation and redemption. Jimmy Dunn, in his Colossians commentary, says that in this text, Paul moves from a cosmology of creation to a cosmology of reconciliation. All things are made by, through, and for him, and all things are reconciled through him as well. The chief purpose of the Colossian Christ poem is to say that he's not simply one of the many powers, many angels or aeons or anything like that. He's far above them. He is the co-author of creation, the divine agent par excellence of reconciliation. He carries the fullness of deity and is even Lord of the church. And we see that Jesus also has pre-existence to creation and pre-eminence over anything in creation as well. Now, let me give my own translation of Colossians 1:15 to 20. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, because in him were created all things in the heavens and upon the earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or lords or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and all things are sustained in him. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, in order that in all things he might have preeminence. Because in him God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, by making peace through the blood of his cross, through him, whether upon the earth or in the heavens. There's a few elements of that translation we will come back to. Now, in terms of background, I mean, there's clear echoes of Genesis 1 with the reference to, he is the beginning in verse 18. But there's also a lot of connections to Hellenistic wisdom traditions. A lot of the things said about Christ in this poem are directly or obliquely also said about wisdom in Hellenistic Judaism. Wisdom is among the first things created in the beginning, or wisdom is at least with God in the beginning. You find that in Proverbs 8, Sirach 1, Sirach 24. Wisdom is the image of God's goodness in the book of wisdom. In the Septuagint version of Psalm 103, all things were made in wisdom, and Philo calls wisdom the beginning and image and sight of God. Now, even with that sort of wisdom background, I should point out as well, a couple of friends of mine, Joshua Jipp and John Anthony Dunn, have both done a good job independently of situating the Colossian Christ poem in relation to royal and messianic discourse. I'll put the bibliographical details of their articles in the show notes below, but they're worth checking. I probably won't have time to go into it. Maybe I'll do an interview with them in the future, but yeah, that's a good aspect as well. Now, what I'm going to very, very briefly do is try to unpack several aspects of the Colossian Christ poem that I think are salient. First of all, let's begin with verse 15, where Paul says, he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. Well, image here, the Greek word icon, conveys the sense of that which has the same form as something, at least visually. So Jesus has the same form or reflection of God, which is kind of reminiscent of Philippians 2 verse 6, where Jesus is in the form of God prior to the incarnation. And the idea of an icon is being a representation or a manifestation of something. The mention of image obviously, harks back to Genesis 1:26-27, where Adam and Eve are divine image bearers. Now, what this divine image is, the Imago Dei, that's disputed at the theological level. But what I do find interesting is that in antiquity, kings in the ancient Near East, also in the Greco-Roman world, were thought to be images of God, or like a shadow of God's representation. So that could mean that this description is being used in the sense of this royal rhetoric, that Jesus is also one of these rulers that God has established on his own, and they reflect his image and his presence in the world. But I think it's more about the connection with all of humanity. So by calling Jesus the image of the invisible God, he's a representation of God, but I think it's also a way of saying that he is the new Adam. And that's something that overlaps with other emphases in Paul's letters in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15. But the takeaway here is that the invisible God is made visible and expressed in Jesus. Second thing Paul says is that Jesus is the firstborn of all of creation. Now, firstborn would literally mean eldest child. You can find usage to that effect in various places. In the Greco-Roman world, the firstborn was usually the designated heir of an estate. Well, in the Old Testament, firstborn can also be used of Israel. Israel is called God's firstborn son. I mean, you find that in Exodus chapter 4, in Jeremiah, and a lot of places. And again, on the royal aspect, Israel's king in Psalm 89 can also be called the Lord's firstborn. Now, this word firstborn, prototokos in Greek, has been a playground for ancient and modern theologians, especially in light of the Arian controversy in the 4th century. I mean, Colossians 1:15 was really the John 3:16 of Arianism. Like to say, he's the firstborn son, the firstborn created thing. He's the greatest angel that God ever made, or something like that. And does firstborn then imply literally that Jesus is the firstborn created thing, like the first great archangel or uber angel that God made? No, I don't think it means that. Because the Colossian poem as a whole refers to Jesus as the author or co-author of the material and immaterial realms, the earthly and the heavenly spheres, human and angelic creatures. I mean, if Paul had wanted to suggest that Jesus was merely the first of God's creatures to be formed, he would have said something like, or using the adjective protokatistos, which means created first, or maybe even the noun protoplastos, for first made. The words for firstborn and firstfruits are ascribed to Jesus in the New Testament, and sometimes they can mean like the first of something, like the firstborn among the dead. I mean, that is a historical priority. That's what's intended there, or the firstfruit. So this language can be used simply in the sense of a priority in a particular class. But I think the way firstborn is being used here, it's more in the sense of a special relationship and with a type of preeminence. So in the same way in which the king of Israel or the people of Israel were God's firstborn, so too in this filial sense, in this strange, mysterious sense, Jesus is also the firstborn. He's the firstborn of a new humanity in certain places, but he also is the firstborn in the sense of being the Messiah, the true representative of Israel in God's plan. Third aspect. Now we're moving to verses 16 to 17. Jesus is regarded as both the demiurge and as the goal of creation. Now, Jesus is a demiurgical figure, and the word demiurge simply just means, craftsman, okay? Since all things are created in him and through him. He's kind of the divine craftsman who's at work in forming creation. And this is a well-known entity in ancient cosmology. Plato speaks at length of the demiurge. The demiurge was very important to various systems of cosmology and Christology in heterodox systems of Christianity in the 2nd century. But this is quite significant because added to that, he's not just the demiurge, a kind of subcontractor. He's pre-existent. He also sustains everything and keeps it together. Jesus is the reason, in other words, why there is a cosmos rather than chaos. So these are big claims. Jesus is the chief agent of creation, the demiurge. He's pre-existent to creation, and he's the glue holding the universe together. But, and I think what is truly unparalleled here, is that Paul says the universe came into being for him. All things exist for the purpose of Jesus. I mean, that is an astounding claim. I mean, I can't think of any other parallel to any other angelic creature or demigod or anything like that. As Ralph Martin says, no Jewish thinker ever rose to these heights in daring to predict that wisdom was the ultimate goal of creation. Wisdom may have been beside God in creation, with God, maybe cheering from the sidelines, but no one ever said that, the goal of creation was so wisdom would be revealed. So this is a very, stark claim that's being made about Jesus. Turning now to verse 18, fourth, we see that he is not just the cosmic Lord, but also the Lord of the church. In fact, the head of the church, the body. And as the body of the Messiah, the church is the physical representation of Jesus on earth. Jesus is the head of the church, not necessarily in the sense of its source, but certainly as its titular head and leader. And so while this poem has a very high Christology, it also has a high ecclesiology. I mean, the church is the extension of the body of Christ. And the body politic metaphor is, very common in antiquity. Paul uses it in various places. But we've got a high Christology and a high ecclesiology as well. So Jesus is supreme in creation and over the church, and the church is his body. Fifth, Jesus is the beginning and firstborn from the dead. Now, we've already touched a little bit on this firstborn language, and the mention of the mention of beginning rather, is a fairly obvious echo of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. But, and this is what keeps me awake at night, many things keep me awake at night, this is one of them. The word arche actually has several different meanings. It can be like first in order, ruler, head. It can also be translated as first principle. So it could be saying Jesus is the first principle and the firstborn from among the dead. Okay, it's a possibility. I don't know of anyone who has taken that translation. I think it's got a certain elegance. Kind of makes sense too if Paul's dealing with the context of Hellenistic wisdom traditions, maybe thinking of Jesus as the first principle, as in the sort of hermeneutical key to all things, or at least the starting place for where you want to understand a theory of everything. I think it does have an attraction, but no one's taken that route, and we have to be cautious because sometimes the road less traveled is less traveled for a reason. But I do think it's a possible translation that Jesus is the first principle and the firstborn from among the dead. And he's the firstborn from among the dead in the sense of being the prototype and the provision for a renewed humanity. Jesus is risen from the dead. He has a glorified body. And that is what is intended for other human beings as well, for believers, for the church. Paul says in Romans that the same spirit that raised from Jesus from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies as well. That's what Paul seems to be getting at. And I think he's kind of, tipping his hat to that here. Jesus is the new Adam for the new age and the new resurrected people. He's the first in this renewed human race. Okay. So a little bit of soteriology here as well, or eschatology, I should say, the end times being brought together. 6, now we're now moving to verses 19 to 20. Paul provides 2 reasons why God has proposed to launch this new creation through the Son. And those 2 reasons are preeminence and divine fullness. God's plan is, to begin with, that all things in Jesus would reach their summit and height. They would all come together in Jesus. In other words, that Jesus would have preeminence. And some translations will say things so that Jesus will have supremacy or Jesus will have first place. But the purpose of creation, all things created for him, is so that in everything Jesus would have the preeminence. And here I think we're talking about authority, honor, power, all rolled into one. The most relevant background I can think of here is the Roman concept of auctoritas, okay, which is a combination of power and prestige. And the Roman Empire, with its very sort of layered or tiered system, particularly in the Augustan age, had this pyramid of power and hierarchy that put the emperor at the very pinnacle of it. And I think the implied rhetoric of the poem, this Christ poem, is that Jesus is the preeminent one. Jesus has all the auctoritas over all earthly and heavenly beings, and all other claims are pretentious before his own preeminence above all things. The second thing that explains the purpose of all things coming together in Christ, or why it's fit for that to be the case, is because it says, in him God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell. Now, this is a little bit of a translation curiosity, because there's no subject for the verb eudeco, pleased. Most people think the implied subject is God, so being like a divine passive, so you have to kind of mentally insert the word God in there. The word God is not actually in the Greek text, so God was pleased to have all his fullness in him. So it means Jesus carries the fullness of the divine being. I don't think just the full suite of powers, titles, and functions. I think he carries the full the full orbit of the things which are divine. I think it's very much an ontological term. What's interesting, though, this word for fullness, the word pleroma, became very important in Valentinian Gnosticism for the totality of all the intermediaries and various emanations from the supreme God. It was kind of like, the pleroma is kind of like the mothership, or the source, if you like, for all things divine and semi-divine, and everything's about getting back to the pleroma, getting back to this sort of college of cosmic order, power, life, and divinity. So I mean, I don't think that word's being used that way here, but that word will have a significant biography, if you like, in the future. And who knows, maybe there is an implied critique of some of that kind of stuff. The whole pleroma is not something that's out there. It's not something that the gods and demigods and wisdom is struggling to get back to. Rather, it's something that Jesus is the very fullness of. He is already the one who has all of the pleroma, which means it's significant. It's fit and right that Jesus would be the chief agent of creation and redemption, because he has the divine pleroma, or the fullness of God. Seventh and finally, Paul says that through him, or by the activity of Jesus, God is able to reconcile all things. The word reconcile in Greek, katalasso, means to exchange hostility for friendly relations. That implies that there was a prior state of alienation and hostility between the creator and the creation, which has now been restored. It's been pacified or reconciled. And here we find that the offended party, God, is the one who takes the initiative in reconciliation in order to remove that hostility, that alienation between him and the fallen, corrupted world of which human beings participate in. And the fact that it refers to all things, ta panta, in Greek, means it's about the restoration of the entire cosmic order, not just so individual sinners can have a relationship with God through Christ, but as Tom Wright would say, about putting the world to rights, or as Ernst Käsemann would say, so God would repossess the world for himself. everything is then reconciled to God through, in particular, the blood of the cross. The cross is the means of cosmic reconciliation. So coming to a conclusion to this Christ poem, I mean, we've seen there's a lot here to look at. We've looked at the image of the invisible God, firstborn over all creation. We've looked at the preeminence of Jesus, how he has auctoritas, he's the goal of creation. I mean, we could keep on going on and on about this topic for ages, but I love the summary provided by Jimmy Dunn. This is what Jimmy Dunn says. He says, "The vision is vast. The claim is mind-blowing. It says much for the faith of these first Christians that they should see in Christ's death and resurrection quite literally the key to resolving the disharmonies of nature and the inhumanities of humankind, that the character of God's creation and God's concern for the universe in its fullest expression could be so caught and encapsulated for them in the cross of Christ. In some ways, still more striking is the implied vision of the church as the focus and means towards cosmic reconciliation, the communion in which that reconciliation has already taken place or begun to take place, and whose responsibility it is to live out as well as to proclaim its secret." I mean, God bless the memory of Jimmy Dunn. I think that is a great way to put it. If you want to know more, I've written a commentary on Colossians in the New Covenant commentary series. I've got a whole big section on that. Otherwise, I'll add a few bibliographical items in the show notes. So yeah, there we have it. Colossians 1:15-20, one of the most important Christological texts, not only in the New Testament, not only in Paul's letters, but I think in all of early Christian literature, and certainly in patristic debates. It would also become key. Not only the reference to Jesus as firstborn from among the dead, but also the view of him as bearing the image of God, carrying the divine fullness. A lot of these verses were used in later disputes about who is Jesus in the early church. So there you have it, Colossians 1:15-20. That's my 7-point summary. So that concludes this week's episode of Nazareth Nicaea. I hope you've enjoyed it. As ever, if you like what you're watching, please subscribe to the channel. Share, leave a comment or a question. I might try do one other episode on Colossians 1. I'll see if I can find a special guest on to talk about this particular text. I've already had, David Capes talking about it, but I think I'd like to do another episode of this, maybe talking about some particular aspect. Maybe I'll talk about its reception in the early church, or maybe we'll talk about its messianic dimensions. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Otherwise, I hope to see you around the channel and for the next episode of Nazareth to Nicaea.